5 after 12, which means it's time to start a new meeting. We'll get going. I'm the department head of Wildland Resources at Utah State University, Mike Coons. And today we have, I think, probably your newest faculty member. This is Larissa Yocom. And Larissa came here most immediately from Flagstaff, where she was I suppose, a postdoc doing fire research there since getting her PhD in 2011 from Northern Arizona. And then got her master's at Yale and her bachelor's, I assume, at Pomona College. And she grew up in western but rural Washington, which I don't think of those two going together. It seems like
Seattle sort of dominates the news.
right.
Yeah.
But we'll hear about the research she's interested in, and then ask questions either during or after. Although I suppose that's partly based on what you want to do.
Okay. Yeah. Either way is fine, during or after. I know we were supposed to video call a different region. I don't know if that's been done. You know?
I think they actually pushed the buttons to make
so that's happened?
happen.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So thanks for...
Is anybody there?
Should I check or just start?
No.
Okay.
Let's go ahead.
We are here, Bill.
Ah, see? Price is calling in.
Okay.
They're always on top of things.
Okay. Okay, so thank you for being here. I am excited to be here in this room and talking to you, and also just to be in Utah and at Utah State. Like Mike said, my interests are fire ecology, and I'm going to talk to you about my research interests, what I think I will do here. But just to start is everyone in here almost wildlife? That's the room I'm talking to, right?
We have about half of them are from our state forestry division as well.
Okay, great. Well, then I don't need to make friends with everyone, but I thought I would start with making friends with the wildlife people. I used to work on wildlife projects before I went back to grad school. So sage grouse project, the cavity nesting bird project, little songbird project. So in case, it might come in handy to know the word lek, I thought I would point that out. Just mention it. So I'm going to talk about just fire in general, and I heard people talking before I started about how they love fire, so I might not need to convince you that fire is important and interesting, but I'll talk about that a little bit. Themes that I've done in my research, some of the skills that I have, and example results and applications, and then the future of what I want to do here in Utah and in the region. So fire, just to start with, is an important driver of everything from ecosystem patterns and process to evolution and distribution of life on Earth, which sounds really important and maybe overstated, but I think it is true. There have been studies that show that without fire, we would have a lot more forest on the planet. So fire keeps savannas open, grasslands open, so it's a hugely important disturbance at the global scale. And the other interesting thing about fire is that it really does have an ecology, which to me means that it influences and is influenced by ecosystems, which is really different than other disturbances. If you think about that, hurricanes, for example, are not really influenced by the landscape, at least to a large degree that they affect. But fire, burns through fuel, so fuel, it affects fuel, and in turn fuel affects fire. So it's really has this interactive ecology to it. Everything from wind, landform, the dryness of the fuels, what kind of vegetation, a lot of things interact with fire. Another point is that patterns of fire are more important than individual fires, if you think about the long term, and that's the fire regime concept. So, one individual fire could be important for a place, obviously, but in terms of patterns and processes and how it affects ecosystems and what kinds of fire plants and animals are used to, it's the pattern over time that's more important than one individual fire. And then the last thing is that, which you're all aware of, the western U.S. is in a fire deficit. So historically there was a lot more fire on the landscape than there is now. There are a few places that have probably not been interrupted in terms of their fire cycle, but most places in the western U.S. have seen an altered fire cycle, need actually more fire. So these are just sort of important, points that I wanted to start with to get everyone on the same page with what I'm thinking about with fire these days. So my research involves the interactions over time and space between fire, climate, people, and forests. And I'm not going to really talk about climate at all today because it's not as applied, but I'll talk about those other three things. So, and when I'm thinking about time and space, I found this figure from a textbook, and I realized this is a small screen, so most of you can't see it, so I'll just walk you through it, but I thought it was a good kind of way of thinking about time and space. So down here, this is time scale in years, so from very short time period up to thousands or millions of years. And here we have spatial scale from very tiny up to maybe a continent. And fire people love triangles, for whatever reason. Fire triangle is the first one. That's oxygen, heat, and fuel. So that's the smallest spatial scale, smallest time scale. And you could think maybe fire physicists would work on questions in this triangle. That's actually combustion. The next triangle up is the fire environment. That's weather, topography, and fuel, and those are the three things that affect fire behavior. And so that can, that's operating at the scale of a single fire, maybe on a scale of an acre up to, 500,000 acres. The next scale up is the fire regime, and that's vegetation, climate, and landform are the things that affect fire in this scale. And it keeps going. Super fire regime, so biome persistence, like whether grasslands or forests or savannas, for example, are persistent on the landscape. And then fire in deep time is the biggest triangle at the largest spatial and temporal scale. So things like evolution of vegetation are at that scale. So most of my work has kind of fallen in the scale of one fire up to fire regimes, so patterns over time. So fire regimes, climate fire relationships. I've looked at fuel treatment effectiveness. That's kind of at this scale in here. Post-fire trajectories, and then disturbance interactions. So those are some of the things I'm going to talk about today, except for the climate-fire relationships. Okay, so some of the types of work I've done is a variety of approaches. So using forest plot data, just measuring what's out there, and using that for a close-up view of what, getting to know one particular spot really well with forest plot data. Another thing that I've done is tree ring reconstructions of historical fire occurrence, and then tree age reconstructions, and you can get at long time scales, so several hundred years if you look at that using that approach. Fire severity data from satellite imagery and large data sets you can get a broad spatial scale. You don't get to know any one place very well, and there's probably errors, but you can look over a whole region. And then systematic review, which is just looking at all the literature and putting it together, and statistical modeling. That's, the strengths of that are using available data that's out there and then trying to understand mechanisms behind patterns. Okay, so I'm going to start with fire history, and I brought some examples of fire history samples, so I'll pass those around. I'm sure you guys have all seen tree cores, but this is just, these are actually from all over the place, so they're not related to what I'll talk about today. And then these, has everyone already seen things like this before? These are fire-scarred trees. So maybe some of you have and some of you haven't. These are pieces of wood. This one was cut out of a live tree, and this one was from a log or a snag or something dead. And the dates on there, every date that you see along those little scars in the tree are fire dates. And so this one's really old. It's got, the first fire date is 1560. And then this one goes out to the present. 1989 is the last fire. So I'll pass those around in case you have not seen those. So one of the projects that I worked on a few years ago is with the Grand Canyon National Park. And it was a manager question. And they wanted to know whether recent high-severity fire patches in mixed conifer there on the north rim were quote-unquote normal. So what are we seeing today, fire patterns that would have been within the historical range of normal? So to give you some background, here's the map of the north rim inside the park. So here's the Colorado River, and then here's the Kaibab Plateau. This is the park part of the north rim. and then up here is the Kaibab National Forest. And they've had 2 fires, the poplar and the outlet, plus some other ones in the 2000s that burned a lot of high severity area. So from 2000 to 2012, over 14,000 acres burned in high severity, and some of the patches were over 1,000 acres. And if you look at the north rim here, inside that purple boundary, if that kept going over the next century, you'd have a lot of high severity fire. You know, it would cover most of your area there. So they wanted to know whether this was something they needed to kind of tamp down a little bit. One of the goals of the Grand Canyon is to put themselves out of business in terms of the fire people. They want to be able to let a lightning strike do whatever it will do. And so they're trying to let fires burn as much as possible, but then they see this kind of thing and they want to know maybe we're going a little too fast with putting fire back in. So we know a lot more about some ecosystems than others. So this the plateau has a little slope to it where the lower elevations are ponderosa pine. It grades up into mixed conifer and then spruce fir. And ponderosa pine burned historically with high frequency, low intensity, and spruce fir burned with low frequency and high intensity, but we don't know as much about that mixed conifer. And that's exactly where those high severity patches were burning. So we focused in on that mixed conifer zone. And we put in a 1,400 hectare study area, which is about 3,000 something acres, 72 plots, and cored hundreds of trees. And we also had fire scarred samples, like the ones I passed around. And we used tree ages and then known fire dates to get at both low severity and high severity fires. So if you have a fire scar on a tree, that was a low intensity fire because the tree kept living. So it was a fire that scarred the tree, but it continued to grow after. So some of those samples you can find trees with dozens of fire scars on them in places that burn a lot. The other thing we did is use the tree cores because if in a place like that, aspen is a really good indicator of some high severity disturbance. So this is after the poplar fire. The very next year, aspen just is up like a carpet. So if you can find patches of even-aged trees that coincide with known fire dates from those fire scars, you can reconstruct high severity fire with mapping those aspen patches. So combination of fire scars and those even-aged patches of trees in a cohort. Does that make sense? Okay, so we use that, and of course the answer is straight, it's ecology. So were those patches that we're seeing today normal? It's really messy. We found a really complex fire regime historically with a mix of low and high severity fire. High severity patches were important in this landscape, but they probably didn't occur at the scale that we're seeing today. So we recommended managing fire for variety, essentially. So the more variety you can get, the better. Both, in terms of fire size, a mix of small and large, severity, a mix of low and high, and then fire intervals. So sometimes you have them really closely spaced, and sometimes it's a couple of decades between fires. So that's what we came to the conclusion in the end. And if anyone has questions throughout now, or that's all I have on that section, so I was going to keep going. Or you could ask questions at the end.
I got a question for
Yeah.
you. Did you tie in any type of live fuel moisture to your studies at all? Do you know what that was in your high intensity fires, or did you tie that in at all? Because that's really a key to when you have a high intense fire is your fuel moisture. You didn't tie that
We
in.
didn't look at that at all. So what we did is look at, we were looking over the past couple of centuries, and if we could reconstruct high severity patch sizes. And so there would be an opportunity to look at climate, but it would be climate reconstructions, and probably not at the scale of, daily or weekly that you might need in order to really make that connection. Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, so fuel treatments is another area that I've been interested in, and one of the projects I've worked on using plot data is from the Rodeo Chediskai fire, which is in eastern Arizona, right here. And it burned in 2002, and it was almost 500,000 acres. It was surpassed in 2011 in size by the Wallow fire in Arizona. But the Rodeo Chediskai was more severe overall. It was a shocking fire in the southwest. So what we wanted to do is, they had done a bunch of treatments, pre-fire treatments in this area. So we had plots in places with no treatment as a control, places that had had prescribed fire, and then places that had been cut and burned, so prescribed fire with a thin. And so we wanted to quantify, and I apologize for the screen size because I'm sure in the back these letters are hard to see. Okay. So we wanted to quantify above ground carbon pools. So carbon pools are live, we just said they're live trees, dead trees, and the forest floor. And we wanted to look at combinations of burn severity and the pre-fire treatments. These plots were measured 2 and 8 years post-fire, and the questions were at the landscape level, how did fuel treatments affect fire severity? And then how did the 3 main pools of carbon change over time? So first, which is a lot of people have found, but it was good for us to see as well, treatments strongly influenced fire severity. So if you look at, here on the bottom is no treatment, prescribed fire, and cut and burn, and this is the percentage of treatment area. So both high and moderate severity fire, the black and the gray, were much higher in the no treatment areas. They declined in the prescribed fire areas, and even the smallest in the cut and burn. Whereas low severity was the lowest, proportion in the no treatment areas, increased in the prescribed, and it was, the best in the cut and burn. So they, fire severity was affected by those treatments. And interestingly also, we found this legacy effect of fire severity. So of course, low severity means you have more live carbon, right? That's what, live carbon is just live trees. It's just, trees turned into a weight, essentially. And then high severity, you have low live carbon. So if you just look at this open circle right here, that's live carbon. Essentially, that's live trees. In the high severity area, it was really low 2 years post-fire, but it declined even more 8 years post-fire. So those trees, even if they were alive 2 years, they were still declining and dying over time after that fire. Whereas in low severity, of course, they kept growing after fire. So you had this big, huge difference in live tree mass after the fire, but they kept diverging in the years after the fire because more trees died after high severity, and the trees kept growing in low severity areas. So it kind of speaks to the idea that a snapshot measurement of anything after a fire is, might not give you the full picture because things are dynamic and continue to decline or grow over time.
What does live carbon tell you?
It's just it's just a measure of carbon stored on the landscape. In this case, the good thing about live carbon, it's just another word for live trees, and so those trees are continuing to amass carbon because they're not dead. They're still going to photosynthesize and add more. So, we looked at it in terms of a carbon perspective, but it's just a measure of how many live trees are there essentially. So, yeah.
So that live carbon doesn't include shrubs or
Nope.
grass or forest?
No. So that's a good question. They don't, in terms of the mass of carbon, they just don't hold nearly as much as a live tree. So they would be important to look at, but they wouldn't change the overall ecosystem amounts of carbon very much, just because they, the stems of shrubs, for example, are so small compared to the bole of a tree. So there's two other things I want to say about this is that, so fuel treatments really strongly affected fire severity, and then fire severity had a big influence on carbon pools. However, treatments may or may not reduce the overall carbon loss from any ecosystem in the event of a wildfire because treatments also remove carbon. So this is a big argument that's going on about whether treatments are worth it because do they save a lot of carbon in a wildfire? Well, they might not. On the other hand, there are a lot of other objectives that people have usually with treatments, not just carbon. So it's just sort of an added bonus that you have continued carbon storage happening after a fire in these low severity areas that have been treated. Okay, any other questions on that part for now? Okay. So another thing that I did with a colleague is look at field treatments, all the literature that's out there. And what we did is we tried to look for studies that were forested areas that had been treated, that had treated and then had control untreated plots, so measurements of both those things, that were later burned in wildfire, so that you could actually, so people that had measured treatment effects in actual fire situations. So here we found 56 studies around the West, nothing here, and these are the kind of some of the things that people were measuring about whether fuel treatments were effective. Effective in terms of what? And so with Overstory, we found strong evidence for effectiveness in terms of fire severity and behavior effects. So treatments, like I just showed you, often are effective in reducing fire behavior in subsequent fires. In terms of all of these other things, the carbon, the understory, there's moderate evidence for that. So a few studies on these kinds of questions. For soils, wildlife, entomology, hydrology, all these other questions that you would think that we might want to know whether treatments are effective for these different questions, there's either weak or non-existent evidence. So this was interesting it was just sort of a look at what's out there right now, what we know about, and what is a big hole in terms of fuel treatment effectiveness. And I'll come back to this later in terms of future research. Okay, I think it's the last thing I really wanted to talk about is wildfire legacies. So I was going to talk about this project, which is still ongoing. So I know this is not true around the West, but in the Southwest, Arizona and New Mexico, wildfire, which is the blue here, the acreage burned in wildfire is just way higher than prescribed fire. And so if you can think of wildfire as treating fuels, then you're treating a lot more acreage than if you just look at the prescribed fires. So this is sort of the impetus for this project, is whether wildfires can be considered fuel treatments. So as more and larger fires burn, you've got more opportunities for fires to interact over time. So there's two types of interactions. One would be reburns, obviously, if fires burn over the same area that's already been burned. And then the second type is where fire perimeters align but don't overlap. So one fire bumps up against the next one and is stopped. So that's so the previous fire is acting as a fuel break. I'll talk about that one first here. And this is my joke about previous fire preventing a subsequent fire from burning into it. Thank you for chuckling. And then you might think, well, there's something else there that's preventing both of those fires, doing a really good job of preventing both of those fires from spreading. And the same is true in real life, because roads are often used as control points by firefighters. And just to give you an example of that, this is a map of several different fires from over a couple of decades, and you think, wow, look at, right here, these fires are stopping each other. Doesn't it look like it? Something is stopping, fires are stopping each other, but then you add the road layer, and there's a road right there. So that's probably what's stopping all of those fires, and the fires are probably not that important. So our question was, to what extent do both previous wildfires and roads limit the growth of subsequent wildfires by acting as fuel breaks? So we took fire perimeters from a big remotely satellite-derived database, and we looked at all fires in Arizona and New Mexico from 1984 to 2014, and that gave us 1,615 fires. And we buffered the fires inside and out. I'll just walk you through this. We just calculated the distance that any subsequent fire intersected that previous fire boundary that was buffered. So this whole area here would line up with the blue polygon there. There's a 2007 fire, 2010. So for every fire that got added, we would calculate how much of the perimeter overlapped with another fire perimeter. We did the same thing with roads after buffering them. So calculated how much of a fire's perimeter just lined up with the road. And here's an example, just what it would look like, and this is from a real fire. So here's a 1994 fire that's buffered, and then here's a 1995 fire. So this section aligns with the previous fire. It's in that buffer area. This section right here aligns with both the previous fire and a road, and then this section just aligns with the road. So we calculated all of that. And then one of the things that we did that I think improved the study a lot was we repeated this analysis. We moved every fire perimeter a random distance and direction from its original location. so that we could see if you just plunked a fire perimeter anywhere on the landscape, would you get the same numbers just by chance? And then we compared the real locations with the randomly moved locations. So what we get is that, again, there were 1,615 fires total. And these are all fires over 1,000 acres. So anything under 1,000 acres, we don't have data on, which is too bad. It might, I don't know how much it would change it, but I'm sure it would, to some extent. 533, so about a third of those fires encountered a previous fire. That means they touched somewhere. The alignments overall with the actual fire boundaries were approximately double the randomly moved ones. So fires are aligning with fires more often than, about twice as often as you would expect just by chance if you plopped a fire boundary somewhere on the landscape. So I'll just focus on this first. So this is the subset of fires that encountered a previous fire, those 533 that did touch somewhere. About 10% of their perimeters on average lined up with a previous fire, and about almost 5% of the randomly moved ones did. All fires overall, so all 1,615, even if they never touched a previous fire, that of course is a much smaller proportion, about 3%. In terms of roads, about 20% of fire boundaries lined up with roads. And surprisingly, the fire and road thing was pretty low, where we had both of those together. So that surprised me. Time since fire was important, so more than half of all those alignments occurred when the time since fire was 4 years or less. And that, so here's 4 years, time since fire, 4 years, and we've got most of these alignments happening with those really young fires. And that's probably not a surprise. It could be an ecological or fuel-related thing, but it also could be confidence of the managers to use the more recent fires as fire breaks versus older fires. Maybe they don't trust them. So it's both an ecological and a management kind of look at what's being used as a fire break. And then the trend over time, if we see a higher proportion of these fire alignments over time, from 1984 to present, you would expect those to increase over time, of course, anyway, because we've just got more fires occurring on the landscape, but we've got a lot more than those randomly moved, so more than you'd expect just by chance. The alignments varied by ownership. So the Forest Service had by far the greatest perimeter burn and the highest proportion that lined up with roads, but the Fish and Wildlife Service had the greatest proportion of those fire lineups. I have no idea why that would be.
Fuels, maybe?
Why?
Fish and wildlife typically is small density fuels, grasses and shrubs and things like that would have higher fire frequency.
Yeah.
Refuges have a smaller, I mean, they don't have the large fuels that they have in there, like Preston said, so that's probably why.
Right.
The refuges are, a lot different.
Those are on, probably less than 10-year fire intervals.
So those previous fires would still be a good fuel break for the next fire. Okay. One of the things that, we tried to do is look at fuel type, and it didn't work out. So it's something that I'm still trying to figure out if there's a way to look at that particular question to see if grasslands, for example, if you have that, if fires are better at stopping subsequent fires than they are in forests or something like that. So still an ongoing question for me. So we had a limited effect of previous wildfires in stopping subsequent wildfires, about 10.5% on average. Roads were more commonly aligned with perimeters. Over 50% of those alignments occurred when the time gap was 4 years or less. We've got fire interactions increasing, and their importance is likely to increase. And then, as I mentioned, we've got, the ecological implications are this process and pattern of fires influencing the landscape that are then influencing subsequent fires. And the management implications are, this is, it's not just an ecological study, it's also what managers are using in terms of their control points. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about reburns too, when fires burn over previously burned areas. So our next question was, to what extent do previous wildfires influence fire severity of subsequent wildfires? So for this, we looked at areas across the Southwest on Forest Service land that burned 1, 2, 3, or 4 times. We actually have places that have burned 6 times since 1984, but The areas are too small, I didn't include those. So we excluded areas close to edges of these polygons, used kind of the bigger polygon areas, and then placed random points all throughout the, these fires. And so we had 83,000 points and extracted burn severity at each point. So this is sort of my take-home point for this. And it's a little bit confusing, but essentially what we found is that places that burn at higher severity the first time were less likely to burn again. So this is fire severity right here, and I'll add on here what are good cutoffs in the Southwest for classifying burn severity. So unburned tends to be in this area, low severity, moderate severity, and then high severity. And the green line here is points that burned one time. So those tended to have higher severity than points that ended up burning 2 or 3 or 4 times. So again, places that burned in higher severity were less likely to burn again. That's really what is coming out of this graph. I know that it's hard to wrap. I just gave this slide at a conference recently, and I feel like I didn't explain it very well. So hopefully this is making sense. So then again, this is just first fire severity. This is points that only burned once, and these are points that ended up burning again, but it's still their first fire severity. Burn severity decreased at more points than it increased for each subsequent fire. So from first to second fire, we had decreased severity at 53% of those points. From second to third, it decreased at 57%. From third to fourth, it decreased at 64%. So with every time the place burned, it was more likely to have decreased fire severity. And then the time since, the time since fire kind of question is also important here. So subsequent fires had lower burn severity. So below this line right here, if they burned within 6 years. So the first 6 years, we've got the average below the line. After that, it kind of oscillates up and down, and it's messy data. But if it burned within 6 years, it was more likely to have lower fire severity.
So with those fires that burn at a high severity, when they reburn, will they reburn again at high severity?
Well, that was the question that we had. But what we found is that there just aren't that many points that are burning again at high severity. So even if you found that pattern, it's not a very fair, that's what a lot of studies have shown, is that high kind of leads to high. But across this landscape of 20 million acres, we just didn't see very many points at high severity burn again. So it's
You
not,
need more time.
you need more time, exactly.
The fuels to regrow
So in
because
only
of the severity of the fire.
in 31 years, it's just not enough time to see high severity areas burning with very much data.
But if they, it might take another 100 years for it to get to that point.
Yep.
But the next time those areas burn, they're more probable to burn at high severity than multiple low severity burns.
Yeah, so it makes sense. It fits in with the idea of the fire regime that usually places that burn frequently burn with low severity, and places that burn with high severity it's infrequent fire because of the fuel question. So I think it kind of matches with our ideas, but most studies that have looked at this are really focusing on, okay, we've got high severity burning at high severity again. And I think those are anomalies, like, shrub fields or something that are maybe not representative of this really large landscape if you look at all the reburns.
If you look at the vegetation, take lodgepole pine, for instance, up in Wyoming and Idaho, they have an 80 to 100 year cycle, and they're going to burn about that same intensity those years, but that's how long it takes them to grow back and have the understory for a fire to start again. If you look at Yellowstone, that's what happened up there in '88. And
Same
that's
thing with like Chaparral on a
Same-
20-year cycle in
yeah,
Southern California.
down there,
'cause
Arizona.
It takes the
Yeah.
foliage that long to regrow,
That's right.
and then it burns at high severity again. Whereas like the desert Southwest,
Yep.
before we excluded fire, had landscape-wide fires at low severity all the time. But it
Because they
was
burn
low
more
severity.
frequently, yeah, that's what it is. And then your fuel moisture comes in there too, like in chaparral, or sagebrush. There's only a certain time of the year that's gonna burn high intensity, versus low intensity at that time too. So
Right.
those two factors really play into it.
Yep. So that's another thing that I have done, I'm not showing it here, is look across those different vegetation types. Look at shrublands, grasslands, different, ponderosa pine, and then even in mixed conifer spruce fir, because those have different kinds of fire regimes historically. And so this is an ongoing project, and I hope to finish it in the near future, but those are the kind of questions I would like to continue to figure out, is the vegetation part. Okay, so for this section, in general, burn severity values were lower with increasing times burn. The subset of points that reburned had lower first fire severity than points that reburned fewer times. And subsequent fire severity was less than previous fire severity when the time since fire was less than 6 years. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about future work. This is an image of the Bryan Head Fire and the smoke plume going up into Wyoming and Colorado. And so the Bryan Head Fire is where I would like to start doing some work this coming summer. Oh, but before I get there, just in general, some topics of interest that I think I would like to, that I think are interesting and I think are important. The idea of low, mixed, and severe fire. So, and I'll have a slide on that, so I won't talk about it. Ecological legacies, which I'll talk a little bit about too. Disturbance interactions, both wildfire interactions, but then also other kinds of disturbances. I'm interested in that kind of thing. Fuel treatment effectiveness, carbon dynamics, and then climate change, which sort of goes hand in hand with a lot of these other ones. So this summer, I'm in the planning stage of starting a project in the footprint of the Bryan Head Fire to look at post-fire tree regeneration across different gradients. So it's kind of a good fire to study because it has a good elevation gradient, different species burned, different burn severity, high severity, low severity, moderate, and then also maybe the chance to look at pre-fire fuel treatments and then post-fire treatments like mulching or grass seeding. So those are, again, planning stage, so I've got way too many things I would love to do, and then I need to figure out what I really can do, but those are what I would like to do. I would also like to look at climate regeneration relationships, so being able to measure these seedling plots over time, and then also look at pre-fire drought stress and whether that affects regeneration in different areas of the fire. So that I'm excited about that, and that I'll be starting this summer. I also am interested in this idea of the low, mixed, severe fire. So we often talk about places that burn with low severity or burn with high severity. So we know a lot about the Southwest burns low severity, at least historically, and in some cases still today. The Boreal or the Northern Rockies burn high severity, but a lot of the West burn and should burn in a mosaic like this. And a lot of people don't even like the word mixed severity because it means nothing. So even in a fire like this or a fire like this, you're going to have some kind of mix of low, high severity patches. So what does this mean? And can you do any kind of quantifying of this by forest type or region or anything like that? I think that's an interesting question. I think we know a lot less about this in a lot of the West than we think we do. And I think it would be, I would like to do more in that area. And I think that would help managers too because, for example, even the Bryan Head Fire, at high elevation, people were worried about the fire intensity and the fire severity in that fire, but it may have burned exactly like it has always burned, that fire. So I think just more information about all the in-between forests, I think is important.
One of the things about the Bryan Head Fire was it was, the fire managers, including, myself and some people who were down there, we could not believe how the fire carried itself in the conifer. And it was unusual for it to do that, especially at that time of the year at that elevation. We never thought that thing would go up and over the hill and down over in the Penguins, the icy, never thought that would happen. We didn't think that would ever happen. Oh, holy cow, did it ever take off when the wind shifted out of the north. And so that was an unusual situation, and we think it was driven because the 1,000-hour fuels were so low that they were what were carrying the fire, not the understory in this situation. So that was an unusual fire in the way that carried itself. So that might, make be part of your study.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing I would like to know is how unusual is it? Is it
Very unusual.
But it's
The
unusual.
loading in the heavy fuels was
It was,
pretty remarkable.
oh yeah, I don't know how many tons per acre you had in there with just stuff like that, but it was a lot. I mean, you're talking 200 to 1,000 tons per acre in there with a fuel, and that helped carry it too. But once it got in that conifer, there was no stopping it till it ran out of fuel.
So with that kind of forest, it doesn't burn very often, right? Every 80 to 100 years? I don't know
No,
what.
not even that often, I don't
200?
think. You're talking maybe every 200 years, maybe 150 to 200, if the conditions are right in that kind of an Engelmann spruce mixed conifer at that elevation.
And then you add like removing fire from the ecosystem,
Yep,
it just changes
that adds
everything.
it
Yeah.
too, so.
You don't have those historical fire intervals anymore because we removed it.
So that's the kind of question that I'm interested in is, historically, because we only live a certain number of years. We weren't here the last time that area burned. So what was it like then, and what was it like over the past few hundred years? And if there's a way we can look at that, look at, mixed severity, quantifying that, I think that would be helpful to know on a historical basis, how unusual was this fire? I
There's
understand it's unusual now.
some old historical records from the Native Americans, back when the country was settled, about how often they would burn, to trap wildlife in certain areas so they could get those to kill them. Particularly down in the pine type, down lower. Now, I don't know about the mixed conifer. I don't know if that happened up there or not, but it could have. But yeah, they used fire in a lot, a lot down through there in some of that lower elevation around probably 7,000, 8,000, 8,500 foot elevation. But I don't know about up at 11,500 feet. I don't know about that.
Yeah. So in the, near Flagstaff, there's the San Francisco Peaks, which they go up to about 12,000 feet, I think. And there's an area called the Inner Basin, which is spruce fir. There's a picture of that area in 1910, I think. It burned in either late 1800s or early 1900 something. And it is just wiped out. Every single tree is dead. Now to look at it now, it's just gorgeous forest, completely filled with trees, live trees.
Right.
So when it burns again, I would expect it to burn the same way. It's just a question
Probably
of
will.
when are the fuels going to get dry enough, and when is there going to be an ignition?
Right.
So those higher elevation forests, and especially the mixed zone, I think it's still kind of questionable.
Yeah.
What it was really, if we're seeing a whole new era, or if it's just the way these forests burn. I don't know. Maybe it would be fun to talk to you more about it.
There's a paper published in the 1990s where we put in excavation units on the backside of Brian Head and bogs. But we went to glacial till and dated those profiles, and that publication came from UGS and USGS
Okay.
for the U.S. Forest Service. And I think the cycle was more like 1,000 years.
Okay.
Because back then they're saying, hey, this forest doesn't burn, but we put those units
Could have
into
been.
those bogs and showed that we could go back that long, and you can see the bugs in there, and you can see the fires.
Would you send me
And
that?
it's in a profile, if I could
Yeah, it could have been that long up at that high elevation, the
find
fire.
it. If I can find it, I will.
Okay. So, that'd be great. So just back to fuel treatment effectiveness, as I pointed out, there's just a lot of hole on the map, and then of course in topic areas, and I think there's a lot of work to be done with fuel treatment effectiveness. We spend a lot of money, a lot of time on them, fuel treatments, prescribed burns and thinning, and there's surprisingly little about whether they work. I mean, in some cases we know they work, but there's a lot of other areas that I think could use more looking at. And then collaborations. So, I am excited to be here. I think that, I'm trying to learn about research needs in this region, in the state and in the region. I value science that, I want my science to be applicable for managers, so I have a strong desire to make it relevant.
Good.
So
Thank you.
So, I think otherwise, don't know, so, and then agency partners, I would, I'm trying to meet as many people as I can, and I would love to work with anybody. If anyone there needs a fire ecologist, that's why I'm here. Now I'm here, and my email address is right there, so I'd love to hear from any of you, and be interested to talk to you more now, if we have a few more minutes, and if there's any questions, I'll take them. Yeah.
Very good.
Are you picking up on it, or carrying on maybe some of the work that Mike Jenkins and Liz Everson did with the spruce beetle and the fires and fuel loading? Because they wrote a paper, I'd say probably in the last 10 years or 15 years, that left the question, what is in spruce, and this gets back to the Bryan Head fire. There was uncertainty as to how fires would behave post bark beetle epidemic. And they went on, I just looked at it, they went on to prophesize that 20 years later there would be a pretty impact result from that. Will your future work embrace their study and then carry on answering some of those questions that they might have expanded on in their first paper?
That would be great. I have not gone that direction yet, but I think it's a good direction to go. I think what's interesting is a lot of studies that have looked at beetle fire relationships show that after the red needles fall off, there's less fire risk. But what I understand from the Bryan Head is that's not true, because the massive amount of coarse woody debris on the ground, that's not red needles contributing to, I think it's a lot of spruce kill, but down trees contributed to the severity of that fire. So I think there is more work to be done. I don't know anything about that right now, and I think that would be interesting to look at.
Do you know if anybody looked at what happened in western Colorado on the Rio Grande, on the West Fork complex? Because that was probably less than 5-year-old bug kill, and it rolled through that stuff. I mean, the Rio Grande, my dad was on the forest 30 years ago. They averaged a couple hundred acres a year, and those fires burned almost 100,000 acres between Durango, which is the San Juan National Forest, and the Rio Grande. And it seemed to me, looking at the fire behavior, that it didn't really matter, red needles or not, whether the tree is standing or not, it rolled. So I'm just curious, because I've read stuff that, after the spruce beetle moves through, you have less of an impact of fire once the red needles go.
That's what I've read too.
Kind of seen
So it
things
seems like that's not
with my own
necessarily.
eyes to the contrary.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that coming up.
Yeah, I don't think that mattered in Bryan Head. There was no way. And I think it was tied to, that 4 or 5 years of no moisture, that live fuel moisture will carry that fire when you get a wind driven up there. And that's what happened with that, with the downfall too. And like Preston said, I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's got red needles or green needles or what.
So maybe maybe the spruce beetle really had nothing to do with that. If it's just you have a drought strong enough to dry anything out, then it'll burn. I don't know. I think you were going to say something else. I don't know if I.
Well, I was just going to admonish that as a tactician of helping people understand the future of their forests, this debate over red forests versus gray forests and burning severity, people are wanting to know what their future is going to look like. And this could be across a watershed level for individual homeowners, private property owners in the forest. And I think that's one, if you can help answer that question or gather the data to help paint a picture of what is truth and what is knowledge, I think it will help us to advise people on what their future might look like, because they're faced with the bigger loss than we who live in the city are facing.
I think that is a really important point, and I think that it's a difficult thing to convince people that we actually need more fire on the landscape, because when they see a fire, like the Bryan Head or any other kind of fire, it's always painted as a negative thing. So that's one of the reasons I'm interested in looking at the regeneration post-fire. So what, kind of like Yellowstone in 1988, the lodgepole was killed, but then immediately there's a new carpet of seedlings that came up, and now it's this, wildflowers. And so I'm interested in looking in this region what happens after a fire, and can we get a sense of what that area will look like in the future? Since we need more fires, we're going to keep having fires, so what's the future? I don't know if that's what you mean. I think probably people want to hear that there aren't going to be any more fires, but that's not, fires will burn, so.
It's a matter of social license.
What's that?
It's a matter of social license, whether people accept fire as not such a disastrous thing, but more of a beneficial thing.
Yeah.
So You know, one of your slides you had, talking about the impacts or effects on wildlife, and I think right now we've got a really good opportunity to encourage you to look at. We have a migration initiative, and we have GPS collars out on about 3,000 big game animals and other species right now. And we have a research project right now we're working on where we're looking at the effects of habitat treatments on deer use of the treatments, things like that. But we have several big fires. We've had the Milford Flat, we had the Book Cliffs, about 100,000 acres. We had the Sealy Fire, about 50,000 acres. Brian we had the Tidwell. And I wonder if it'd be interesting to go back and look at where we have GPS collars and look at with the different time frames of, from when the last fire was, if different intensities of wildlife use or how they're using the area. And Daniel Olson's our coordinator that's over that project.
Okay.
I really encourage you to get with him. I don't know, what do you think, Ashley?
Yeah, I'm actually gonna meet with Larissa after this. If anybody wants to stay and just talk about research ideas or questions you want answered, feel free to stay and talk about those things with us, but.
Henry's is another one, 40,000 acres down there.
Okay, I would like to write those down and the name that you mentioned too. You can tell me.
Yeah, I'll get that.
Okay, great. Thanks. Well, it was nice to meet everybody. Well, I didn't really meet you, but glad to see you all. Thanks for having me. And hopefully I'll see you again sometime.